It was a cold, dreary afternoon when Michael stumbled upon the mirror at a dusty old flea market on the outskirts of town. He hadn't planned on buying anything, but the moment his eyes caught the ornate, weathered frame, something drew him in. The mirror stood out, almost as if it was waiting for him, calling to him. The vendor, a grizzled man with sunken eyes, offered a cryptic smile as Michael approached. "That one's been around for a long time." "Some say it's cursed," the vendor muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Michael chuckled, dismissing the comment as just another sales tactic. He wasn't superstitious. But there was something about the mirror. The way it glinted, almost pulsating in the afternoon light, sent a shiver down his spine. Despite the unease creeping into his gut, Michael bought the mirror. It was an impulse decision, the kind he never made. He wasn't one for old, creepy antiques. But as he loaded it into the back of his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror had chosen him, not the other way around. Back home, he placed the mirror in his living room. It fit perfectly, adding an odd, Gothic charm to the space. But that night, as he passed by the mirror on his way to bed, he thought he saw something off. A flicker, maybe? Or was it just the dim lighting? He paused, staring into the reflective surface, but nothing seemed out of place. He brushed it off, blaming his exhaustion, and went to sleep. The next few days, Michael found himself strangely drawn to the mirror. He would catch his reflection at odd angles, and each time, it felt like his reflection lingered just a moment too long. His face, though his own, seemed different. Darker. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself it was his imagination, that growing pit of dread in his stomach told him otherwise. As the days went on, Michael's fixation with the mirror grew. It was subtle at first, an extra glance in the morning, a lingering stare before bed. But soon, he found himself standing in front of it for longer periods, almost hypnotized by his own reflection. It was as if the mirror held some unspoken secret, and he was desperate to uncover it. One night, as Michael stood before the mirror, his eyes locked on the reflection staring back at him, he felt something strange. His reflection blinked, just a second too late. His breath caught in his throat. He rubbed his eyes, stepping back for a moment. "I'm just tired," he muttered to himself, his voice shaky. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The next morning, Michael tried to shake off the creeping unease, convincing himself it had all been a trick of the light or his own tired mind playing tricks. Yet, as he shaved in front of the mirror, he noticed it again. His reflection moved, slightly out of sync, like a delay in a video feed. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He turned away quickly, his heart pounding, but the image of his face, his reflection's face, lingered in his mind. It had looked wrong. His eyes had seemed too dark, almost hollow. By the end of the week, Michael had begun to feel like he was being watched. Not by anyone in the room, but by the mirror itself. Every time he passed it, his skin prickled with the sensation of eyes boring into him. At night, as he tried to sleep, he swore he could hear faint whispers, barely audible but present, like distant voices carried on the wind. They seemed to come from the direction of the living room, from the mirror. Things escalated quickly after that. Michael found himself avoiding the mirror during the day, but at night, he couldn't help it. Something drew him back. He would stand in front of it, staring, almost daring it to do something. And, inevitably, it would. His reflection would smile when he wasn't, or its eyes would darken in a way that sent chills down his spine. There was no denying it now. The mirror wasn't just a reflection of him. It was something else. Something watching him, mimicking him, and slowly, it seemed, trying to become him. It wasn't long before Michael began losing time. He would look into the mirror in the morning, and the next thing he knew, hours had passed. His phone would have missed calls, messages unanswered. He'd blink, confused, staring into his own reflection, trying to piece together what had happened. But his reflection just stared back, expressionless, as if mocking him. The final straw came one evening when Michael returned home late from work. Exhausted and on edge from the increasing sense of paranoia, he walked past the mirror, fully intending to ignore it. But as he glanced sideways, he froze. His reflection was there, of course, but something else was too. Standing just behind him, in the shadowy corners of the room, was a figure, a dark, indistinct shape, barely visible but undeniably present. Michael spun around, his heart racing, but the room was empty. There was nothing there. He turned back to the mirror, his breath shallow and quick, but the figure was gone. It was just him again. Just his reflection. Except for one thing, his reflection wasn't smiling. But now, Michael was. Michael's world began to unravel after that night. He started to notice changes in himself, small at first, but growing more pronounced with each passing day. His friends would comment on his appearance, asking if he was feeling okay, noting that he looked tired or pale. But it wasn't just fatigue that was dragging him down. It was something deeper, something darker. The mirror was becoming an obsession. He avoided it during the day, covering it with a blanket, but it didn't help. The presence he had felt, the figure in the reflection, seemed to follow him everywhere now, a constant shadow at the edge of his vision. When he walked into a room, he would feel it, like cold fingers brushing the back of his neck. It wasn't long before he started hearing the whispers more clearly. They weren't just background noise anymore. They were voices, dark, malevolent voices calling his name, urging him to look, to return to the mirror. The more he resisted, the more the entity seemed to invade his life. Michael would lose chunks of time, whole afternoons slipping by in a haze. He'd wake up in places he didn't remember going, his phone full of unanswered calls, his hands trembling as if he'd been gripped by some unseen force. At night, his dreams were filled with dark, twisted images, his own face, distorted, grinning back at him from the mirror, as the shadowy figure loomed behind. One evening, Michael's best friend, Derek, came by unannounced, worried about him. "Man, you haven't been yourself lately. You look like you've seen a ghost," Derek joked, but his eyes were filled with concern. Michael tried to shrug it off, but when Derek glanced at the mirror, a chill settled over the room. "What's with the blanket?" Derek asked, pointing at the covered mirror. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't told anyone about the mirror, not the full truth. How could he? It sounded insane. But Derek was already walking over to it, reaching to pull the blanket off. "Don't." Michael's voice came out sharper than he intended, and Derek froze, startled. Michael's pulse was racing, and he could feel the presence, stronger than ever, lurking just beneath the surface of the glass. Derek frowned, sensing the tension in the air. Okay. I won't touch it. But, dude, you need help. This isn't normal." Michael nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The whispers had started again, faint but persistent. "Look, just look," they called to him. After Derek left, the house felt suffocatingly quiet. Michael stood in front of the covered mirror, trembling. He knew what was happening. The entity wasn't just influencing him anymore, it was becoming him. That night, he uncovered the mirror. His reflection stared back, but it wasn't his face anymore. It was twisted, distorted, almost inhuman. The eyes were too dark, the smile too wide. And the figure, the shadow, was no longer in the background. It was standing right behind him, clearer now, its form more defined. Michael could feel its breath on the back of his neck, cold and suffocating. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. The entity's grip on him tightened, its presence overwhelming. His reflection began to change, subtly at first, then more drastically. His reflection's hands moved when his didn't, reaching out toward the glass, beckoning him closer. Suddenly, the world around him seemed to shift, as though the air itself was thickening, pulling him toward the mirror. His vision blurred, and for a terrifying moment, Michael felt himself being drawn into the glass. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening now. "Look, give in, let go." Michael stumbled back, his chest heaving as he gasped for breath, but the reflection didn't follow. It remained there, grinning. He knew it now, the entity wasn't just a part of the mirror anymore. It was inside him, taking control, and there was no escaping it. By now, Michael could hardly tell where he ended and the entity began. The line between reality and the reflection had blurred beyond recognition. Every time he looked into the mirror, it felt like a piece of him was being drawn away, replaced by something darker. His once vibrant eyes now carried a hollow, sunken look, his skin pale and gaunt, as if the very life was being drained from him. One morning, as he stood before the mirror, something changed. It wasn't just the whispers, or the feeling of being watched. This time, the entity spoke directly to him. The voice was deep, almost guttural, reverberating through the room like a slow roll of thunder. "You are mine now," it said, and Michael's blood ran cold. He tried to turn away, but his body wouldn't respond. His hands gripped the edges of the mirror, his knuckles white, as if some unseen force was holding him in place. His reflection began to move on its own again, but this time, it was clearer than ever. It wasn't just a trick of the light. His reflection smiled, a twisted, malevolent grin that sent a wave of nausea through him. He could feel it now, the entity's presence pressing against his mind, whispering, coaxing him to give in. It was no longer content with small manipulations, it wanted full control. Over the next few days, Michael found himself losing control of his actions more frequently. He would watch, powerless, as his body moved on its own, performing tasks he had no memory of starting. Once, he woke up in the middle of the night to find himself standing in front of the mirror, his hand pressed against the cold glass, the reflection grinning back at him. He didn't know how long he had been there or what he had been doing, but the sense of dread was overwhelming. His mind began to fragment. He would have conversations with people, friends, co-workers, and then later have no memory of them. When he looked at his phone, there were messages he didn't remember sending, phone calls he didn't remember making. He was losing time, more and more each day, and with every lost moment, the entity's hold over him grew stronger. One evening, Michael decided he had to do something. He couldn't keep living like this, trapped in his own body, slowly being consumed by whatever was inside that mirror. He did something he hadn't done in weeks. He called his sister, Jen, the one person he trusted to help him. She arrived an hour later, immediately noticing how much he had changed. "Mike, what the hell is going on?" "You look awful," Jen said, her eyes wide with concern as she stepped into his apartment. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. It was like his throat had closed up, the entity refusing to let him explain. "Is it the mirror? What's wrong with it?" Jen asked, glancing at the uncovered glass on the wall. Michael's heart raced as he tried to warn her, tried to scream for her to stay away from it, but all that came out was a choked whisper. Jen moved toward the mirror, her expression a mix of curiosity and fear. The air in the room grew heavy, suffocating, and Michael could feel the entity's presence intensifying. "No, don't," Michael finally managed to rasp, but it was too late. Jen was standing in front of the mirror now, her hand inches from the glass. Michael lunged forward, grabbing her arm and pulling her away. She yelped in surprise, staring at him like he had lost his mind. And maybe he had. "Mike, what's gotten into you?" "You're scaring me," she said, backing away from him. But before Michael could respond, a cold, dark laughter filled the room. It wasn't coming from either of them. It was coming from the mirror. Jen's eyes widened, her face draining of color as she finally saw it, saw the figure standing behind Michael in the reflection. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but before she could say anything, the figure in the mirror moved, stepping out from behind Michael and into the room. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. The entity had crossed over. For the first time, Michael saw it clearly. Tall, gaunt, with eyes like black voids and a smile that stretched too wide, the entity was everything he had feared, and more. It stood there, towering over them both, its presence overwhelming, filling the room with an unnatural cold. Michael could feel its power, the darkness wrapping around him like a vice, tightening its grip. Jen screamed, but the sound seemed distant, muffled, as if the world itself was fading away. The entity reached out toward Michael, its long, bony fingers curling around his shoulder. His vision blurred, his body weakening as the entity's voice echoed in his mind. "You belong to me." Michael felt himself slipping, the last fragments of his will crumbling under the entity's control. He knew, in that moment, that there was no escape. The mirror had taken him, just as it had taken everyone before him. Michael's grip on reality had all but dissolved. His life became a waking nightmare, the entity's control tightening with every passing day. He could no longer trust his own thoughts, his own actions. He would find himself standing in front of the mirror for hours, staring into the abyss, feeling as though the entity was consuming him piece by piece. His reflection no longer resembled him at all. It was a twisted, monstrous version of himself, smiling wickedly as the entity manipulated his every move. Jen had stopped visiting after that horrifying night. She had seen enough, and no matter how much she pleaded with Michael to get help, he refused. He couldn't explain it, but deep down, he knew there was no help to be found. The entity had chosen him, and there was no escaping it. His once orderly apartment had become a dark, oppressive space. The mirrors reflected nothing but nightmares now, and Michael had isolated himself from everyone, the fear of what he might do to them too great. One evening, after days of isolation, Michael's body moved without his consent. The entity had taken full control. He watched in horror as his own hand reached for a shard of broken glass, one of the many fragments from the mirror he had shattered in a desperate attempt to free himself. His mind screamed in protest, but his body no longer responded to his will. Slowly, methodically, his hand brought the shard to his arm, and he watched as the entity forced him to press it into his skin. Blood pooled on the floor, but Michael felt nothing. The entity had numbed his senses, trapping him in his own body like a puppet. It was feeding off his despair, his hopelessness. His reflection grinned back at him from the cracked remnants of the mirror, its eyes gleaming with malice. Michael's strength was gone, his mind teetering on the edge of collapse, and he knew the end was near. But the entity wasn't satisfied with just consuming him. It wanted more. It wanted to use him. Michael's body, still under the entity's control, moved toward the front door. As he opened it, the cold night air rushed in, but he felt nothing. He stepped outside, the entity guiding him toward the street, toward the people walking by, completely unaware of the horror lurking inside him. His hands trembled as he approached a passerby, a middle-aged man walking his dog. The man smiled at Michael, but that smile quickly faded when he saw the blood dripping from Michael's arm, the blank, lifeless expression on his face. "Hey, are you okay?" the man asked, his voice laced with concern. Michael wanted to warn him, to tell him to run, but his mouth wouldn't open. The entity wouldn't let him. Instead, his body moved forward, the shard of glass still clutched tightly in his hand. The man's eyes widened in fear as he backed away, but it was too late. Michael's hand shot forward, the glass glinting in the streetlight as it connected with flesh. The scream that followed was muffled, distant, like everything else in Michael's world. He watched in horror as his hand, guided by the entity, plunged the glass into the man's side again and again. Blood sprayed across the pavement, but Michael could only watch, powerless to stop the horror unfolding before him. The entity reveled in the chaos, its laughter echoing in his mind as it used his body to carry out its dark desires. When it was over, the man lay lifeless on the ground, his dog barking frantically at his side. Michael dropped the glass, his hand shaking uncontrollably. He could feel the entity's satisfaction, its hunger temporarily sated. But as the blood pooled around him, he knew this was only the beginning. The entity wouldn't stop. It would use him again and again, until there was nothing left of him but an empty shell. As Michael stood over the body, the cold wind biting at his skin, he realized there was only one way out. He couldn't live like this, couldn't let the entity continue its reign of terror through him. Slowly, he turned and walked back into his apartment, his legs heavy, his mind numb. He picked up the phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed the number. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice crackled through the line. Michael swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper as he said, "I killed him. It wasn't me, but I killed him." The operator asked for more details, but Michael didn't listen. He couldn't hear anything anymore. The only sound in his mind was the entity's laughter, echoing in the empty spaces of his consciousness. He sat on the floor, his back against the wall, staring at the shattered mirror across the room. As the sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer, Michael glanced one last time at the mirror. His reflection smiled back at him, but it wasn't his smile. It was the entity's. And in that moment, he knew he was already gone. When the police arrived, they found Michael sitting in a pool of his own blood, the shard of glass clutched tightly in his hand, and a haunting smile on his face. The entity had won.